Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. So glad that you're able to watch today. As we look at the state of affairs today in our world, many people would say that things are deteriorating. They'd say things are becoming less Christian, less moral, there's more conflict, more war, more instability, and so on. And I agree that there are signs of that, but I also believe that great things are happening, that God is on the move, and that things are actually turning around. And there are so many positive indicators of that. But we are in the middle of a war, a long-term cultural war. The Bible talks about spiritual war over and over again. Ephesians chapter 6, Paul the Apostle says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of the darkness and spiritual wickedness in heavenly places, and tells us to put on the armor of God and to stand against these evil things. And I get asked often, Richard, I want to do something, I want to get involved, but how do I make a difference? And I want to share three things with you in this monologue session today before we go to our very special guest. But these three things are actually pretty simple. And Truth and Liberty exists. We have been formed to equip, educate, and unify the church, to become involved, to mobilize you. And so everything we're doing here at Truth and Liberty as a part of Andrew Womack Ministries is to equip you and get you engaged so that you can make a difference. So these three things I want to share with you today are really pretty simple. And the first one of them is start local. You know, many of us will watch the news or listen to these famous podcasts, and we'll hear about what Trump is doing, or about what Elon is doing, or about what George Soros or Barack Obama, and it's all national or world level. We don't hear really very often about what's going on the local level. But the truth of the matter is that all policy has to be implemented locally. All government action, and inaction for that matter, takes effect actually on the local level. And local is where we can make the biggest difference and bang for our buck of anywhere. And it's the easiest place to get involved. You know, Acts chapter 1 verse 8 says, Jesus spoke to the disciples before being taken to heaven. He said, "You shall be witnesses of me, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost parts of the earth." Acts 1:8. You notice how the Lord said to begin in Jerusalem? We need to start local. If you want to make a difference in this world and you want to get involved, now is the time. And good news is you don't have to be elected president today. You don't have to be elected to Congress or anything else like that. All you need to do is get involved at the beginning point. What's the first step for you? And I want to suggest to you guys today that the very first place we need to look to get involved is in our very own families. What is happening with our kids and our grandkids, our nieces and our nephews? Are they enrolled in public school? If they are, I promise you, they are being indoctrinated in an anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-American worldview. So what can you do about it? What can your church do about it? Well, you can begin teaching your kids a biblical worldview, for example. You could go to Andrew Womack's website, the Truth and Liberty website, and you could purchase Biblical Worldview series and begin to teach your children out of this if you don't feel equipped already. Some of our strategic partners, like David Barton's Wall Builders, have excellent materials on the Christian heritage of America. And I ask you today, if you're a parent or if you're a grandparent and you have influence over your children who are parents, I want you to consider the possibility of homeschooling. Get your kids out of the public schools. Whatever you have to do, get them out of public schools. And whether that's putting them in private Christian school. Keep in mind, private Christian schools are not all alike. Some of them are almost indistinguishable from the public schools. Some of them are pretty good. Homeschooling, though, you can control what your children are learning. And don't think you have to be some college professor or super educated in order to effectively run a homeschool. You don't. There are great resources out there by the droves. We've homeschooled. My wife's homeschooled, and it's not as difficult as what you might think. Another thing to think about is you could come to the Summer Family Bible Conference here at Andrew Wommack Ministries. It's going to be over the July 4th weekend here in Woodland Park, Colorado, and begin to learn, begin to get connected, begin to connect with like-minded believers. Go to the Truth and Liberty website. Check out our resources page there. We have one of the most extensive resources pages of any organization in America. It's designed to get you equipped. So start with your family. What about your church? That would be your next level, wouldn't it? Is your church teaching a biblical worldview in all matters? Does your pastor talk about socialism, free enterprise? Does he talk about racism? Does he talk about gender issues? Does he talk about abortion? Does he talk about government? You know, there's ways for you to fill in the gaps in your local church. One thing would be to get that biblical worldview program, ask your pastor for permission, but begin teaching it as a Sunday school or as a small group ministry. Or how about getting a hold of Patriot Academy's Biblical Citizenship Program? I tell you what, Rick Green has developed I think it's a 12-week program, maybe 8 weeks, that is sweeping America by storm. It's in thousands of churches across our country today, and anybody can lead it. All you have to do is go through the program, become a Constitution coach, and lead your own Biblical Citizenship program. How about starting a civic action team in your local church? What do I mean by that? I mean a group in the church that people that are concerned about what's going on in our country, people that want to see us restored to our Christian heritage. They want freedom, they want truth and accountability again in our country. Well, start getting together with these guys. Start talking about what's going on. Start holding meetings. Invite candidates to come speak. Invite activists to come speak. Bring in information for your church and take, organize activities where you can go and be salt and light. If you need a formal organization to connect with, I want to recommend to you Culture Impact Teams, sponsored by Family Research Council. Excellent program. Or Salt and Light Councils, sponsored by Salt and Light Ministry. Dran Reese is the founder of that organization. Both of those will enable you as a small group in your church to become super effective in your community. How about doing outreach? Connect with evangelism training materials like through Evangelism Explosion. How about a ministry to the homeless? How about ministry to single women? Ministry to women facing unplanned pregnancy? How about tutoring in your local schools? All of these are ways that you can get involved in your church and start making a difference. I want to suggest to you as well, outside of your church, that you should become involved in your local political party. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, it needs to be the Republican Party. Republican Party is definitely not perfect. Lots of problems there, but it is a far cry better than the Democrat Party. And if you're active in other parties, I would submit to you that you're kind of spinning your wheels at this time. America's still a two-party system. The Republican Party platform is most closely aligned with biblical values and sound American principles than any other. And so I encourage you, get involved in your local Republican Party. Most of them will hold monthly or even sometimes more frequent meetings. Start going to those meetings. Get involved, begin learning about what's going on in your local community. I promise you that opportunities will present themselves for you to get involved and make a difference. You'll start meeting people who are also like-minded and involved. Another example, or idea for you. Locally, local. Start attending local school board meetings where you live. Start attending your town council or city council meetings. Start maybe volunteering at a local pregnancy resource center, or find out where a local Tea Party chapter is, or many other groups and organizations. You can find a list of our strategic partners on our website at truthandliberty.net. Connect with these organizations. Start at the local level. I promise you that within a very short amount of time, if you attend these meetings regularly, there's going to be more opportunities for you to get involved than you can handle. You're going to have to pick and choose. How about volunteering for a candidate? We have school board elections all over America this year. Find a school board candidate that you like, back them, knock doors, make phone calls. Next year, a major election year in America. Start getting involved with candidates and make a difference. Okay, the next thing I want to say, so it's get involved locally. Now I want to say get informed. Brothers and sisters, listen to me now. Getting informed to make a difference is more than just watching Fox News. You're going to have to do more than watch Fox News and the Daily Wire to be informed, okay? You need to make sure that you have a biblical worldview. Do you understand what the Bible has to say about the issues of our day? One of the things you can do, I really encourage you to do this if you haven't, is to sign up for the Truth and Liberty newsletter. Just become a subscriber. Go to our website, truthandliberty.net, click on subscribe, share your email with us, and you'll begin to get all the important information that we share all the time. Information about upcoming shows, meetings, conferences, events, our resources here at Truth and Liberty, action alerts, announcements from our strategic partners, and other things. Also, I want to encourage you to go to AmericanMinute.org, Bill Federer's organization. Sign up for his daily email. It will come into your inbox every day, and you will learn things about American and world history from a Christian and biblical perspective that you can't learn almost anywhere else. You won't get it in school. You won't get it on the nightly news. You will not get it anywhere else from political candidates, but you will start to become one of the most truly educated citizens in America. And start going to these meetings that I mentioned earlier. Start a culture impact team in your local church. Through these things, you will get informed. And once you're informed, you'll be able to inform others and lead others and begin to make a difference. So what do you care deeply about? What is the passion of your heart? Then why don't you connect with organizations that are already involved in that arena, reach out to them, and see how you can make a difference. And I'm talking about, I want you to be givers. I want you to support financially. But what I'm talking about right now is just another step forward. See about volunteering. See about connecting with local chapters and stuff like that. Get off your couch, get out of your lazy boy, and actually get out into the community. You're like, Richard, I've never done this before. I'm scared. People might think I'm weird. People might, I'm not as smart or I'm not as knowledgeable as other people. I want you to stop worrying about those things because they're not true. No one's going to think you're weird. Well, unless you're already weird, I would say. But no one's going to think you're weird because you're showing up. Because every one of these people all started from the same place. Concerned, moved, grieved about what's happening, determined to no longer sit back and ignore what's happening, but to do their part as Christians and as Americans to make a difference. They're going to respect you for it. They're going to be glad that someone else is showing up. Someone else cares. And they're going to help you find a way for you to make a difference. And the last thing I want to share with you in my monologue portion is start local, get informed, and the last thing is keep showing up, right? Let's be realistic. One time showing up to a city council meeting, you're not going to make much of a difference. 2 times showing up at a Board of Education meeting, you're probably not going to make much of a difference. Going maybe 3 times to a local party meeting, you'll begin to learn stuff and meet people, but if you stop there, you're not going to make a difference. Listen, folks, we have to keep showing up. It's faithfulness that counts. It's time and again being there. The more you show up, the more you learn. And the more people you meet, the more people you know, and the greater influence you're going to have. Leadership and opportunities for influence will come to you if you are faithful. All right? I want to give you an example out of the Bible. Mary Magdalene. In Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, the Bible tells us that Mary Magdalene is a woman that Jesus delivered from 7 demons. And the Bible says that Mary, along with several other women, ministered to Jesus out of their substance. They traveled along with the disciples in their ministry, and they helped provide for their physical needs. Mark chapter 15, verse 40 says that Mary Magdalene stood afar off when Jesus was crucified. Mark 16:1 says that she came to anoint Jesus' body with spices after he was crucified. In Mark 16:9, Jesus appeared to her first. John 20, verse 18, she was the first person to share the resurrection of Jesus Christ with another living human being. She was the first disciple. I'm telling you, Mary kept showing up. When Jesus touched her life, she decided to follow him and kept following and was there at every major event in his ministry and there when he was crucified for our sins and when he was raised from the dead. Who did he first present himself to? The woman who kept showing up. And the Lord gave her the great honor, eternal honor of being the first evangelist. So I want to say to you today, all you've got to do is start small, start local, get informed, and keep showing up. And one thing will lead to another. And before long, you will be a world changer. You'll be the cream of the crop, the elite, making a difference in our world today. Guys, our guest today is an incredible individual. His name is Alex Newman. Alex is an award-winning international journalist, an educator, an author, and a consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. He's the CEO of Liberty Sentinel Media, and Alex has written for a wide array of publications in the United States and abroad. Currently serves as a contributor to the Epoch Times, correspondent for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief. He's a senior editor of the New American Magazine and a writer for WorldNet Daily. He contributes to George Magazine and many others. He's appeared on Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, NTD, Real American Voice, TBN, CTN, and many, many others. He's also been featured in several docuseries in recent years, including Fox News series Miseducation of America, Kirk Cameron's Homeschooling Awakening, and many others. He's authored and co-authored several books, including his most recent one, which is about education. So we're going to talk about that in the show today. But he also I want to mention his book, Deep State, Obama, World Federalism, and more. So go to Alex's website, but don't go away. We're going to share a little announcement with you and be right back as I sit down with really incredible author and thought leader today, Alex Newman. So we're going to be right back after this. Hello, everybody. This is Richard Harris, Executive Director of Truth and Liberty. I just wanted to reach out today and thank our generous sponsors for the recent Truth and Liberty Awards Banquet. Our awards banquet, and let me tell you, it was an awesome event, by the way, just a couple of weeks ago. But our awards banquet is an annual fundraiser. And we had a number of really generous sponsors this year for our banquet, and we want to thank them because their generosity is what enables us to fulfill our mission to educate, unify, and mobilize the body of Christ to stand for truth in the public square. So on behalf of Andrew Womack, we'd like to thank the following sponsors for their support. First, Lair Enterprise, our Patriot sponsor at $50,000. Dorothy Brown, Fortress sponsor at $10,000. And then we had a number of flag bearer sponsors, beginning with J.H. Reich Construction at $5,000, although these are $5,000. Convention of States, Crisis Aid International, Charis Christian Center, Salem Radio, and then we had a Herald sponsor at $2,000, Constantine Copywriting and Media with Jenny Constantine, and also a number of Minutemen sponsors. These folks gave $1,200 each. ARK Investing, thank you. Colorado Life Initiative, Carol Stevens, Michelle Clausen, Ed Paremba and Daniel Paremba, Alan and Patricia Wensler, Malachi and Gracia Black, Kermit Redinius. Also, Envoy sponsors, wanted to mention Ernest Albrecht first, and then Jamie Miles Black, Reed Brose, Mark Browning, Chuck and Cheryl Gwynn, Carol Hampton, Ed and Mona Shirley, Dolores Tatum, and Ruth Turner. Each one of those folks sponsored an individual ticket for those who couldn't afford to come. It was a great night, and thank you to all of our donors, especially these sponsors who help us do what we do. So God bless you all, and thank you very much. Welcome back to the Truth and Liberty Show. As I said, our special guest today is Alex Newman. I'm just really honored and thankful to have him joining our program. Alex, thank you so much for coming on Truth and Liberty today.
It's a great honor to be back. Thank you very much.
Alex, you are one of these guys who you could probably speak on, more issues than we could cover in 3 shows. But I want to just dive in to something that I think is an ongoing issue for us in America, something people really don't fully understand yet. But that's the idea of the deep state. And just wanted to ask you if you could kind of spell this out for us. I mean, we've heard about the bloated bureaucracy and big federal government and all this ever since the Carter years, and Reagan wanting to reduce it. But that's not really quite the same thing as a deep state. Can you comment on what is it that we mean by that phrase? Is it real, and how big of a problem is it?
Sure, I'm very happy to do it. In fact, this subject is so important that I decided to write a book about it in 2020. It's called Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. Because, first of all, I noticed there was a lot of confusion about this. I mean, Americans know intuitively that something fishy is going on here. The Monmouth University Polling Institute did a survey around that time that found 75% of Americans recognize we have a deep state, as they defined it in the poll, which was a group of unelected officials working behind the scenes to try to manipulate national policy. And I think that's a good starting point for a definition, but I think we need to examine it on several different levels. You mentioned the bureaucracy. There is absolutely an entrenched bureaucracy within the federal government. And this, by the way, extends way beyond just the federal government. It bleeds down into state governments. It bleeds out into international institutions. But it is a permanent class of unelected bureaucrats who have their own agenda. right? And on a very superficial level, the agenda is more power, more control, and they operate very much independently of the elected government of the United States, and they brag about this on a regular basis. I've got a video of one of the former heads of the CIA bragging that, actually praising his God, I assume deity with a little g, that the deep state was working to take out Donald Trump, the man elected by the American people to be the president of the United States. So they're pretty open about this. So you've got like the senior executive service, this whole upper level management class of bureaucrats that are basically impossible to get rid of. Very, very ideologically like-minded. They believe in more government and always more government. They believe they know better than we do how we should organize our lives. They believe they know better than other countries how they should organize their lives. And so on a very superficial level, I think that's what is meant by a lot of people who talk about deep state. In my book, I actually take it 2 steps further. There is a massive network around the world of different organizations and even individuals who have some pretty nefarious agendas. And if you listen to what they say, if you read their documents, they're not shy about admitting those agendas. They want a more globalized world. They want to centralize more political and economic power at the regional and then the international level. And there are some that are secret, right? There's the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. There's the Bohemian Grove in Northern California. And then there are some that are not quite as secretive. You've got the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. You've got the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. You've got the Bilderberg Group, meets once a year. 120 to 150 of the most powerful people in the world get together. And so I think that's the deep state behind the deep state, is how I refer to it in the book. And I don't think you can understand the bureaucratic deep state without understanding the interconnections between the upper layers of the bureaucracy and all these institutions that I'm talking about. They meet in secret, they do weird parties, they discuss policy behind closed doors, and this is very easy to document if you know where to look. And last but not least, and I'll leave it here, I think we need to look at it from a biblical perspective. Right? If you read your Bible from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there are some things that become very, very clear. There are wicked forces in the world. In fact, the Apostle Paul refers to Satan as the god of this world. In 1 John chapter 5, we read that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. So clearly, these evil, as Paul calls them, powers and principalities have quite a bit of influence. And they have an agenda, right? They're waging war on God, and to do that, they're waging war on God's people. They're waging war on the moral principles and truths that God has established. And if you go back all the way 3,000 years to David in Psalm 2, he talks about something that probably sounded kind of weird. The kings and the rulers conspiring together or taking counsel together against the Lord and his anointed one. And we know how this ends, right? Jesus Christ wins and reigns supreme. But in the meantime, there are evil spiritual forces, diabolical spiritual forces that are working largely behind the scenes to try to wage war on God and his people and his truths. And I think Christians need to confront that reality. It is taught throughout the pages of Scripture, and yet in America, so many Christians kind of assume that that doesn't apply anymore. It does apply, and it's very real.
And I think you're right, Alex, that it's a theme throughout Scripture. You can see it as far back as the Tower of Babel, where Satan is trying to unite mankind under his rule in rebellion against God. And is that ultimately where we're headed? Do we as Christians have any ability to delay, resist, fight against these evil forces?
Well, whether we can stop it or not that's up to God, right? I just say God has called on us to oppose and expose and resist evil. In fact, he says to love God is to hate evil, right? And so we have an obligation, I think. Ephesians 5:11, I'm a journalist, that has been my motto from the beginning of my career. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them and reprove them, is how one translation puts it. And I feel very blessed that I get to do that 6 days a week. Praise God for that. So I think we have an obligation to stand against, to rebuke, and to expose. The results ultimately are up to God. But you said something very important about the satanically inspired one world government. I don't think you can understand what's happening without understanding that biblical piece of the puzzle, right? You look at, and I don't mean to imply, by the way, that every bureaucrat in the deep state or every UN globalist understands that they're part of this diabolical plan. But if you look at the things that God has ordained, right? I mean, going all the way back to Genesis, all the way back to the first few books of the Old Testament, we have God very clearly outlining certain institutions and certain truths about how we should live, right? He divides people up into nations, for example. You read that in Deuteronomy chapter 32. You read it in Acts chapter 17. It was God's idea for man to be divided up into nations. That story is actually in Genesis chapter 11, as you mentioned, the Tower of Babel. God tells these people to spread out across the whole face of the earth, and they say, no, actually, we're just going to hang out right here and build a big tower, and we're going to reach up to heaven. And so it was God's design to scatter people across the world and to divide us into different nations, tribes, and tongues. And so nations are one of the institutions that God created. He designed this humanity to exist for now, broken up into different nations. And we see all the way at the end of time, we still see these nations. And so we see a satanic effort to undermine the concept of nations, open up the borders, we're all one humanity, et cetera, et cetera. And the same effort is also targeting families, another institution that God created and designed. We see this very openly, trying to take down marriage, trying to turn boys into girls, and all this kind of crazy stuff. And then that same effort, trying to take down the church of Jesus Christ. God established the church. He told us how the church should run. And so we now see a blatant attack from the world, from Satan, on the church of Jesus Christ. So all of these institutions that God ordained, including the institution of marriage, are under attack. And I think the only way you can make sense of these global efforts is to understand that they have their foundations, the foundational explanations for this are found in the scriptures, and to try to look at it through any other lens leads to confusion and a misunderstanding of what's happening. Same thing with property. God said, thou shalt not steal, therefore God expects people to respect others' property. It's a God-given right. Theft is evil, therefore government must punish evil. And so in this country, we have a very interesting history. And if you read the first words of our founding documents, right, it starts off in the Constitution with "we the people." That means all those relevant scriptures having to do with civil government apply to us, right? You're not going to be able to say, oh, well, that was Trump or that was Biden, right? We have some measure of accountability for this. God has given us very clear instructions for how civil government ought to operate. He has called on us to submit when possible, but he has also called on us to defy wicked decrees. And this is also very clear in the scriptures from the very beginning all the way to the very end. In Exodus, the Hebrew midwives telling Pharaoh they will not murder those baby boys, despite the decree from Pharaoh. Now you fast forward, you've got Daniel, you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego telling Nebuchadnezzar they will not bow down to that golden idol. And so we as Christians, we are called to submit. In this country, we are certainly called to be active participants in that, but there comes a time where we have to say no. Right, and God's people have done that throughout human history, even into the New Testament. Of course, John confronting the king about his wife, right, ended up with his head chopped off. So we understand there will be consequences for rebuking wickedness in government, but we still have an obligation to do it. And for hundreds of years, we've had it so easy in this country that it's been very easy to forget all of those biblical instructions that we have about civil government. Folks, it's time to remember them. God put them in the scriptures for a reason, and so consult your Bible for more.
Okay, so circle back then to this deep state thing for just a minute, if you would. Did the Obama administration take the whole concept of this deep state to another level, unlike we've seen before in America?
Well, I think Obama was kind of the culmination of processes that were set in motion long ago, right? Obama could not have just showed up into a godly Christian nation that wasn't sacrificing babies by the millions and waved a magic wand and unleashed all of this evil on our country. Unfortunately, Americans allowed the situation to exist where he could rise to power and unleash this kind of evil on us. In some ways, I almost regard it as divine judgment from God, right? We know God punishes nations as a whole for the wickedness of those nations. And of course, he does hold individuals accountable as well. But if you look back through the Old Testament, we repeatedly see examples of God punishing whole nations. And sometimes he uses tyrants. Sometimes he uses pagan tyrants to punish sometimes even his own nation, right? You see Nebuchadnezzar taking the Hebrews into captivity. Why? Because they had gone a-whoring after other gods and they were engaged in wickedness. So I regard what happened with Barack Obama and also what happened under Joe Biden to be, in one sense, yes, judgment by God, but in another sense, the inevitable result of Americans not holding fast to what God has taught us about government. Our founding fathers put into place a very decent framework. I mean, I don't think it's perfect. Some people regard it as inspired. I'm not one of those people, but a very good framework based largely on biblical principles. And over a period of generations, We abandoned those principles. Government got totally out of control. And then in steps a guy like Barack Obama to say, hey, I'm going to bring change. I'm going to bring hope and change.
hope and
And
change.
ignorant people who have not been reading their Bible say, oh, hope and change. That sounds good. And of course, we end up with a catastrophe in terms of more money for killing babies, in terms of the total desecration of marriage, in terms of the White House being lit up in LGBT rainbow flag colors. In terms of him publicly saying, whatever we once were, we're not a Christian nation now. We're a Muslim nation. We're a pagan nation. So I think on the one sense, it is judgment. In another sense, it's the inevitable result of our own foolishness in not holding fast to what God has taught us.
Well, so Obama hired, thousands and thousands of new federal workers. He purged the military of its conservative leadership, or he attempted to do so. And my understanding is that he aggressively planted woke activists throughout the federal bureaucracy at a level that we hadn't seen before. And along comes Donald Trump in 2016 saying, I'm going to drain the swamp. And I think everybody would say, well, good try, Donald, but you came up way short. Do you think he's going to be more successful this time? Although he's not using the same terminology, he seems to be going after it pretty vehemently.
Yeah, he's absolutely been far more successful this term. And to your point, during the first term, we really got to see the deep state in action. And you're absolutely right about Barack Obama. If you look, I mentioned the Senior Executive Service earlier. This is not a very well-known institution, but it is the upper leadership of the bureaucracies, not the political appointees, but the layer just below them that's in charge of implementing the policy. And what Obama did was he filled the ranks of the SES with his loyalists and his minions. In fact, more than 2/3 of the members of the Senior Executive Service were actually put into place by Barack Obama during his term, so that when Donald Trump got there, the entire leadership of the bureaucracy essentially was against him. And in many cases, very openly so. The FBI produced reports saying, like, the government is resisting the commander-in-chief, the chief executive officer of the federal government. So they knew that this was going on. And we saw this across the military, as you pointed out. They did a very significant and comprehensive purge of the loyal, patriotic, God-fearing officers within the military. And they did that very deliberately and very strategically. They did the same thing with the federal judiciary, filled the ranks of the federal judiciary with ideologues who were not interested in upholding the Constitution, but who were interested in advancing the revolution that Barack Obama, I think, saw himself as ushering in this country. And Biden tried to replicate that during his term. I don't think quite as successfully, but what has happened is Donald Trump learned a lot during the 4 years that he was out of power. He had a lot of time to think about this. He had a lot of time to reflect on who were the people who were really supporting his agenda during the first term and who were the snakes who were trying to infiltrate the administration to mitigate some of that damage. And there were plenty of them. There was one guy from Homeland Security who wrote a piece in the New York Times patting himself on the back because the deep state was trying to sabotage Donald Trump. But he said, we're the steady state, right? And so Trump has learned a lot. He's gotten much, much more effective in terms of trying to combat this. But it is a very, very difficult task. I don't know that he will be successful over the long term if we don't deal with some of the structural things like the mass murder of babies and things like that. But at a surface level, he is doing far more to outsmart the deep state than he was able to do in the first term.
Well, we could spend all hour talking about it, and I would like to, but I want to cover some other stuff with you, Alex, while I have you. And one of the things that I want to talk about is the subject of South Africa. It's in the news right now, some controversy about it. Donald Trump is allowing refugees from South Africa into the United States, and the left is calling him, racist, that he's doing this because these refugees happen to be white. Now, I understand you lived in South Africa for a while and you know something about this. Can you fill us in on what's really going on here?
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you. I actually moved there on the day of my 18th birthday, and I've got a lot of love for South Africa and for all the different peoples that live in South Africa. But I think the first thing to understand is South Africa is not and never really has been a nation in the true sense of the term. It's a collection of many wildly different nations, right? You look at the Zulus, you look at the Xhosa, you look at the various people groups that live there. They have totally different languages, totally different religious traditions. And you realize that the idea of South Africa as a nation was really a construct that came out of the British Empire. There is no such thing as a South African nation. Excuse me for the coughing.
Yep.
And the Afrikaners in particular, I have a strong affinity for them. I would argue that they are the closest thing we have anywhere in the world as Americans to cousins, right? Far closer to us than the British are. They moved to Southern Africa very much for the same reasons as the early settlers came to move to the Americas. They wanted religious freedom. They wanted a chance at prosperity. They wanted to build Christian civilization somewhere beyond the reach of authorities that didn't want them reading Bibles and didn't want them doing other Christian practices and living out their faith. And they were very successful, incredibly successful, in fact. And they created two independent republics. And this is where our histories begin to diverge, right? We fought the British and we won. Our war for independence was successful. We kicked them out of here. The Afrikaners, mostly descendants of Dutch and French Huguenots and Germans and Danes, they ended up going to war with the British because the British wanted to undermine their republics. They found out that there was wealth under their feet, and so they decided they were going to come in and try to control that. And the Afrikaners, unfortunately for them, were not successful. In fact, the British Empire put their wives and children in concentration camps, treated them horrifically to the point where they couldn't fight anymore. You had 500,000 British troops taking on 50,000 boys and young men, Afrikaners on horseback. So that's where the histories begin to diverge. And what has happened over the last few decades is we actually had a communist revolution in South Africa. People don't realize that. Now, the apartheid system was obviously nasty in quite a few ways. A lot of that was a legacy from British imperialism. You know, the British Empire had racism kind of woven throughout it, despite some of the good things that it did. And so the Afrikaners kind of inherited some of that legacy. And at least officially, the explanation for what they were doing was, look, Europe works much better divided up into nations, right? Hungary for the Hungarians, Sweden for the Swedes, Germany for the Germans, France for the French, Italy for the Italians. So why don't we do the same thing here in Southern Africa? We got a lot of different nations. We'll let the Zulus govern themselves in Zululand. We'll let the Tswana govern themselves in Botswana. We'll let the Swazi govern themselves in Swaziland. We'll let the Zoto govern themselves in Lesotho. And so that was at least their official thinking. And some of those nations, by the way, remain independent to this day and far more successful than their neighbors. Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland are all good examples of that. And so they had a very advanced country relative to anything else that existed on the African continent. And despite some of the really nasty elements of apartheid, I would argue that the South African government had by far the best human rights record of any government on the continent, to the point that millions of Africans from across Africa were flooding into Southern Africa to find jobs and to find liberty and to get away from mass murdering dictators backed by the Soviet Union. So what happened there, you had the Soviet Union take a very special interest in this. South Africa sits on some of the most valuable deposits of minerals and precious metals, some of them which are absolutely essential to weapons systems and modern industry. And so they're sitting on this enormous pile of gold, literally and figuratively, and the Soviets took a big interest. You had this part of the world governed by Christian, Western-minded, pro-America people, and they said, well, we can't have that. So the communists got very active there. The first communist party ever set up outside the Soviet Union was the South African Communist Party. It was an extension of the Soviet Party. And their original slogan, incidentally, was "Keep South Africa White," right? So it shows you this wasn't even really a racial conflict to begin with. They were just looking for how they could gain control of this territory and these people. When they realized that wasn't strategically the best way forward, they rebranded themselves as the Party of Liberation against the evil white racist. But they formed a coalition. They found anybody that they could find to join this coalition and essentially went to war against the system and the people who lived there for the purpose of turning it communist. And they were absolutely brutal to anybody who resisted them, black or white. I mean, you look at what they did to the Zulus, you look at what they did to black South Africans who stood against the communist revolution. Some of the things are just unspeakable. Nelson Mandela's wife was actually a very open advocate of what they call necklacing. They would put a tire filled with petrol around the heads, primarily of black people, and set them on fire. And it's one of the most agonizing deaths you can imagine. That's actually how Nelson Mandela and the ANC landed on the U.S. list of terrorist organizations for so long. And
Alex, wow, that was an incredible summary. Most of it, I'm sad to say, I didn't know. Nelson Mandela's wife was a communist and advocated for necklacing people.
Yep, very publicly. She was caught on tape doing that. And this is going to offend some people, but fact check it. Nelson Mandela was also a communist, not just a communist. He was a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party. And by the way, when he passed away, the ANC, the African National Congress, which governed South Africa in a coalition with the South African Communist Party after the Afrikaners voted to surrender power, both admitted that he was a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party his entire political career, even though he lied to the world and insisted that was not true.
So Nelson Mandela, held up by the entire world as this suffering figure of peace and non-violent resistance and, classical liberal thinking, actually was a Marxist communist that intent on violence and oppression of non-communists.
And that is very easy to prove and document. In fact, at his own trial, the amount of evidence that they had was enormous. Nelson Mandela was very proud of the fact that he was leading what they called the military wing of the ANC. The ANC, the African National Congress, it didn't start this way, but it was eventually taken over by the South African Communist Party. And the military wing, it's called MK for short, was unbelievably brutal. They bombed civilian targets. They bombed shopping malls. They bombed banks. They murdered hundreds and hundreds of people. They planted mines along farm roads to indiscriminately target farming families who were on the land. Again, they didn't discriminate between blacks and whites. They would murder anybody who got in their path. And if you look at the evidence that was assembled at Nelson Mandela's trial, in any other country at that time, he would have been hanged for that. So in his later year, and people look back and they say, well, at least he didn't exterminate all the Afrikaners when he got out of jail. And I think that's a pretty low barrier to have this kind of adoration. And if you look at the things that he did do, he brought abortion into South Africa. He brought the LGBT agenda into South Africa. He brought the South African communists always had what they called a two-phase revolution. He brought in the first phase of the revolution. We're now in what they call the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution. And what you see is the second phase is what we've seen in all the other communist revolutions. Steal all the land, kill everybody who gets in your way until we live in utopia, which of course utopia never comes, but it's always a meat grinder on the path to that fake utopia.
So what's happening now in South Africa, you're saying, is the communist government really is attacking the Afrikaner population there, killing, stealing, torturing, maiming, forcing them off the land, confiscating their farms, and these are the people that are fleeing to the United States for refuge.
Precisely. And nobody will ever know that from reading the fake media, okay? But I lived down there and I had some inkling of this, but what really set it off for me in 2012, the world's top expert on genocide went to South Africa. His name is Dr. Gregory Stanton. He's a very nice guy, and he actually got his start in all this as an anti-apartheid activist. He was working to bring down the apartheid system, which again was not a very nice system. And he went down there in 2012 on a fact-finding mission. And I encourage people to go back and look at what he said after his mission. This is what caused me to write my first major piece on South Africa since I had left there. It appeared on the cover of the New American Magazine in 2012. It was called Genocide and Communism Threaten South Africa. And what we did was we put a picture of, they have a monument there to Plaasmoorde, which is the Afrikaans way of saying farm murders. Thousands of little crosses on a hill, each one representing an individual victim of these horrific attacks. And I'll get to the attacks in a moment. So this expert, Gregory Stanton, comes down there. He's been studying genocide his entire career. And at that time, he had developed a model, the genocide scale, that included 8 different phases. After an in-depth study of South Africa, he concluded that South Africa was at stage 6 out of 8 on the genocide scale. They were specifically targeting the Afrikaners. Stage 6 was the planning and preparation phase. Stage 7, the actual extermination, which he said was probably imminent at that time. And then stage 8 was denial after the fact, where they say, oh, we didn't commit any genocide. What are you talking about? This wasn't a genocide. So they were at stage 6. And he said, we know that the South African government, we have evidence of direct complicity by the South African government in these attacks. And if we had a legitimate media in this country, all Americans would have known this. You had the president of the country at that time, Jacob Zuma, a pagan polygamist. He actually got in trouble for rape one time, and he said, how could he control himself? The woman was wearing too short of a kanga. True story. He was going into stadiums and singing in front of troops songs like, bring me my machine gun, we're going to shoot all the Boers. His deputies were going on stage in front of tens of thousands of troops singing, kill the Boer, kill the farmer. Okay. And whenever somebody did raise a concern about it, they say, oh, we don't really mean it literally. Like, we're not really going to kill. Except thousands of these people were being murdered in the most brutal fashion imaginable. I won't get into the details because they're too gory, but it involved horrific rape, torture, mutilation of babies, of little children, of elderly women, rape of anybody they could get their hands on. And then very frequently, they would leave a Bible on the bodies of these victims. And so I actually interviewed a lot of the people who had gone through these attacks, some of the survivors, people who had lost family members. And I'll tell you what, it's heartbreaking. And what really struck with me is this is not a racial conflict, right? This, as far as I'm concerned, is an effort to eradicate the last vestiges of Christianity and Christian civilization on the southern portion of the African continent, because it's a giant roadblock, it's a giant obstacle to the total communist takeover of that place. So, people need to understand that the media has lied to us about almost everything, and these are not new problems. I'm very grateful that Donald Trump has started saying this is a genocide, because as far as I'm concerned, it is. And I know that sounds strange to a lot of American liberals who still watch the media, but an honest look at the facts will show clearly that this is what's going on.
So Alex, so our folks understand, once again, Afrikaners and Boers are almost synonymous terms when you interchange them like that. But the Afrikaners are the people that came to South Africa for religious freedom, for other reasons, in the 18th and 19th century, I suppose, from Germany, Holland, Denmark, France, and other places. And these people now are being, and all we heard about through the 70s, through the 90s, into the 2000s was apartheid, where the white people were oppressing the majority black population. And now the tables are turned a little bit, but it's like, it's not what we thought. This is communism that's been there since the beginning, and now the communists are killing these people with European heritage, or white people, whatever you want to call them. But it's not like racial hatred primarily. It's actually communism at its core. Am I understanding all this correctly?
Absolutely. Yep. And the communists here in the United States, they had a slogan back in the 60s and the 70s, the Students for a Democratic Society, the terrorists under the leadership of Bill Ayers. They used to say the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. And that's what we're seeing here. They wanted to frame this as a racial thing. It wasn't a racial thing. The issue was always the revolution. Now, the distinction, Afrikaners are basically a nation that was forged in southern Africa. They have their own language called Afrikaans, which is a descendant of Dutch, in some ways still similar to Dutch. Very Calvinistic religious theology. They come from the Dutch Reformed tradition. And they were formed into a true nation in southern Africa. They weren't a nation when they arrived. They started in the mid 1600s under the leadership of Jan van Riebeck when they were trying to set up a post on the Cape, which, by the way, there were no black Africans on the Cape at that time. There were nomadic, they call them Khoisan people. And the Boer in Dutch and in Afrikaans means farmer. And so a segment of these Afrikaners trekked into the country, the Voortrekkers, set up these two republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, and started farming, which was, the Dutch, of course, are some of the best farmers in the world. So that's where the term Boer comes from. Technically, it means farmer, but really it's an identifiable people group. And, at this point, Afrikaner doesn't necessarily mean an ethnic thing anymore or a racial thing anymore. They've been so intermixed with the black Africans, with the Asians that were brought over there by the British and the Indians. And at this point, there's not really like an Afrikaner ethnicity, although most of them have lighter skin than typical Africans. But what does unite them is their faith. And the seminal moment in the creation of this nation back in the 1800s, they actually were trekking inland. They tried to make a deal with the Zulus to get a little bit of land to settle on, and one of the Zulu kings, King Dingane, said, hey, you go fetch my cows from this rival warlord, and I'll give you this land, and you'll be able to settle here. So they went, they fetched the cows, they gave them back to Dingane. Dingane stabbed them in the back, literally impaled them. Horrific betrayal. And so then he sent a war party after them, over 20,000 highly trained Zulu warriors, Impi, to go wipe out this Afrikaner party of about 500 people. And they prayed, they got on their knees. They said, God, if you get us out of this, we are your people forever. We'll honor you. Our kids will honor you. And that's who we are. They often saw themselves kind of reflected in the Old Testament stories about Israel, wandering and this kind of stuff. And so that was the Battle of Blood River. And there's a huge monument to this. I mean, that's one of the defining moments in the creation of this nation called the Afrikaner nation. And so Christianity is at the very core of who they are. Nelson Mandela always hated that. It's quite ironic because he actually got his education from Christian missionaries, right? But he radically turned against the Christians, and now they try to demonize these people, many of whose ancestors have been there, again, far longer than black Africans on the Cape area. They've been there since the mid-1600s. They try to demonize them as settlers and colonialists, but it's not a racial conflict. I believe it is an effort to communize that country. And in a very real sense, I think it's a microcosm of what they hope to do to Christian societies around the world, right? You look at South Africa, this collection of a lot of different nations having very little in common, pagans and cannibals and Christians and radically different cultures, some of which have been at war with each other for centuries. And you put them all under one unitary, all-powerful government, as the South African government is doing now. They claim the authority to steal your stuff. They call it expropriation without compensation. Steal your farm that's been in your family for 300 years. They can steal it without giving you a penny. And putting them all under this unitary, racist, communist regime. Now apply that to what they're trying to do to the rest of the world. Get all the nations of the world to surrender their sovereignty to a one world system under the UN. And you get a sense of where this will be going. And what's really terrifying is that a lot of the same tactics they used in South Africa, we're now watching them replicated in the United States. And to go back to Barack Obama for a moment, Barack Obama will publicly tell you his career in political activism began with the situation in South Africa.
Well, that kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it, back to the deep state? So Alex, let me ask you, we don't have a lot of time left in the show today, but I want to ask you to comment on education, if you wouldn't mind. One of Trump's agenda items is to abolish the Department of Education at the federal level, return education primarily to the states. We can debate about how successful he's going to be on that without congressional action. But on the bigger picture, in America today, only 1/4 of our public school students are proficient in math and reading. In other words, they're reading at only 1 out of 4 read it or do math at grade level. This is for what is one of the most advanced, prosperous nations in the world, and we lay on top of that all of the woke indoctrination, the LGBT indoctrination, the lying to parents, the suicide rate among our teens, and everything else. Our education system, I'm sure you agree, is in terrible condition. What is the solution to this? Maybe a little bit about what are the causes in the time we have remaining. Can you just comment on that?
Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to do so. In fact, my latest book deals with exactly that subject. It's called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. And I was very honored to have people like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth endorse the book, General Flynn, National Security Advisor in the first administration, Kirk Cameron, a lot of great Americans. The lady who wrote the foreword was actually the superintendent of all the public schools for the state of Arizona before stepping down in 2020. And so when we talk about what is the cause of this catastrophe, masquerading as a public school system, I would argue that the most important cause is departing from what the scriptures teach. Right? The Bible is filled with instructions on how Christians are to educate their children. Ephesians 6:4, Proverbs 22:6, Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11, and I could go on and on about Bible verses. God has told us very clearly how we are to teach our children. First of all, that's a parental responsibility. It's a family responsibility. The idea of giving our children to government for education is a new and a very radical idea. The people who came up with this idea, I actually start my book in chapter 1 with the first guy in the modern era to seriously propose that the government ought to educate our children. He was an occultist who claimed to be communicating with spirits that were giving him these ideas, and he claimed to be waging war on the Trinity of evil. So this will give you some perspective about where he was coming from. The Trinity of evil was marriage, private property, and the church or religion. Okay, so he was determined to wage war on those things. The spirits were telling him to do it. His name was Robert Owen. And he actually set up an organization to promote these ideas. It didn't take root right away, but that's what he wanted to do, to turn Americans away from God, away from the Bible, away from their family, and away from the beliefs in individual liberty that are rooted in the scriptures. So it was all downhill from there. If you look at all the key people who built this system, John Dewey is almost universally regarded as the founding father of our education system. This is a guy who went to the Soviet Union to get ideas about education and couldn't stop singing the praises of the Soviet Union. So it's a guy who started a new religion. They called it humanism. They actually called it religious humanism. So to their credit, at least they were honest. And the very first tenet in their manifesto, the Humanist Manifesto, is religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Right? In other words, there's no God. Your Bible is fake, right? The first words in our Bible say, in the beginning, God created. So what comes from this poison seed is the poison fruit that we're seeing all around us. And I think if we want to solve this in a serious way, we've got to go back to what the Bible teaches. God doesn't outline the whole curriculum for us, right? We don't know exactly how many credit hours of English God thinks we ought to have, but we do know the basics. Right? Proverbs 9:10, Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? So there's your starting point right there. So what all the early church fathers said, in the early history of the church. So we've got to get back to those ideas. I personally have my kids enrolled in Classical Conversations. It's a national, actually an international group. We've got over 135,000 students now. I serve as a fellow there. It's a classical Christian model of education, and I love the way they describe the purpose of education. It's to know God and make him known, which is a radical departure from what the world teaches today, but it is, I believe, what God intended for education. So I'm pleased with a lot of what Trump is doing, but the reality is we need to think much, much bigger. Tinkering around the edges of this is not going to solve it. And we've got to get back to this issue because I believe it's the one on which everything rises or falls.
Well, and I agree 100% with that. What do you say to parents that can't afford private education for their kids? What options do you encourage them to take?
Well, homeschooling is almost free, right? My wife and I have been homeschooling from the very beginning. And there's some sacrifice. I don't want to mislead anybody here. We live on one income. But when we started this, I was earning, I don't know, maybe $25,000 a year. We lived in a very small house, and we drove one very old car, and we ate a lot of beans and rice. But you know what? Praise God. He is faithful. He made a way. Our kids have grown up with a great Christian education. They know the Lord. They fear the Lord. One of my younger ones was just baptized on Easter Sunday. And so praise God. When you're faithful and you follow his instructions, he will make a way. I know it may seem daunting, but just take that step in faith, right? Be Peter, just step out of the boat, walk on the water, and God will make a way for you, even if it seems impossible. Just be faithful to his commands, and he will make a way for you. Yes, you'll have to make sacrifices, but they will be the best investment you make in your entire life.
Closing comments, Alex, we've talked about a lot today, but how important is it for Christians to get involved in education, whether that's the local school board, homeschooling, whatever the case may be?
I truly believe it is the most important issue of today. I mean, I see it as a Great Commission issue. Sometimes I talk to pastors and say, oh, well, we just focus on the Great Commission and the gospel. We're supposed to be making disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey, and yet we're losing 80% of our kids in our church. Explain to me how that works, right? First, you make disciples of the kids God entrusted to you in your home. Then you deal with the nations out there. So, folks, it is critical, whether you have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews or just love kids, this is the battle that we need to be focused on. And if we don't train up our children to love and fear the Lord, we're going to lose all these other battles that we are fighting. So I can't emphasize strongly enough, it's the most critical battle, in my opinion.
All right, Alex, a few seconds left. Hold up your book again for me, would you mind? The one on education. I haven't seen this yet. And it's called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. That looks amazing. It's not hard to read, is it, brother? Because you're awfully smart.
It's written so that anybody can enjoy it and understand it, and I really appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much for having me on the program today.
Yeah, it's been great having you, Alex, and we'll put your website up and all of that, but I wanted to remind our viewers about our free product that we're giving away on Truth and Liberty. It's my booklet called The Calling to Manhood. It's only this thick. It's a lot skinnier than Alex's book, but you can get this for free. Go to truthandlibertygtn.com today, but please, everybody, go check out Alex's website, pick up a copy of that book, and let's all do everything we can to get involved in our schools from every level and every place, homeschooling, public schools, private schools. We got to turn this country around. Alex Newman, folks, thanks for coming on the show, Alex. It's been an honor to have you.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
And thanks to everybody for watching today. We'll see you again next time on Truth and Liberty.